Hello and welcome back to Sustainable AF. In this first series, we're taking you on a guided tour of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which are a framework designed to help us build a more sustainable future.
I'm Alex. I used to be in banking and now I'm focused on regenerative agriculture.
I'm Felicia. I'm a writer, business strategist and teacher specialising in the transition to a low-carbon future.
This week, we're going to look at SDG 8, and that's decent work and economic growth. Sustainable and inclusive economic growth appears to be such a fundamental goal as it can drive progress, creating decent jobs for all and improve living standards. Things that are all important to everyone. This week, we're going to take a closer look at what we actually mean by this. What counts as decent work and why is it so important? And how the way in which we define economic growth may define the future we face.
The reason these issues are so basic to the way we live is because work and economic processes are the way in which society organises itself through the economy. How we treat each other within this framework tells us the underlying truth about what we actually value as a society. But they are different, and we're going to look at them separately.
What is decent work and why does it matter?
We're going to look at things like the minimum wage, the living wage, and even the potential for universal basic income.
What do we mean by economic growth, and are there approaches where constant growth and the exploration of resources is no longer a model fit for purpose?
So that's looking at new growth strategies and understanding the fundamentals of capital in all of its different forms.
So today we're going to talk about
what is decent work and why does it matter?
What do we mean by economic growth?
New growth strategies, so how we can understand the world in which we live.
Understanding the fundamentals of capital in its different forms.
Taking a look at GDP and whether it's the best metric to measure growth.
How we can account for nature. People should have work that provides them with the ability to house, feed and clothe themselves and their families. Economies should continue to grow so they can grow economies for their citizens and ensure that investment exists for the development of new ideas, technologies, and even industries. The economy can be considered the backbone of our society, but how can we innovate to organise the economy in a more sustainable way? And how can we ensure that the production and consumption will not result in the depletion of the planet's resources and therefore the destruction of ecosystems?
Sustainability is everywhere these days and growing, and more people are interested. And obviously we're really happy about that. But one of the things we have to make sure of is that the sustainable development pathway we choose is a true pathway to sustainability and doesn't fall short. There's so much negotiation around the standards and the terminology and the agreements that business and governments are making. It's crucial to understand the detail of what our future looks like and how we can achieve it.
On the positive, over the past 25 years, the numbers of workers living in extreme poverty has declined dramatically, despite the lasting impact of the 2008 economic crisis and global recession. In developing countries, the middle class now makes up more than 34% of total employment, a number that has almost tripled between 1991 and 2015. So there's a lot of positive grab handles to take here when looking at decent work and economic growth. However, there are definitely some holes.
Yeah, there's always, the old phrase is the devil's in the details. As the global economy has continued to recover, admittedly, we're going to have to talk about COVID separately because that's been a major hiccup. But even while and when the global economy was recovering, we were seeing slower growth and at the same time seeing widening inequalities between those who have the most and those who have the least. At the same time, there wasn't enough growth in jobs to keep up with the growing labour force. According to the International Labour Organization, over 200 million people were unemployed in 2018. The thing about with the lack of decent work is that without decent work, people are exposed to the risks of many other SDGs like poverty, hunger, and the loss of good health.
As we've highlighted to you, the SDGs are fundamentally interlinked. Without decent work, people are exposed to the risk of many other SDGs like poverty, hunger, and a loss of good health. Once an economy starts to get stronger, mass production can lead to longer hours, bad pay, and even child labour. So the next step is to look at working conditions like worker safety, equality, and fair wages. This will allow us to follow a sustainable development pathway.
Now, we have mentioned that COVID's had a hugely detrimental effect on economic growth and decent work, but we have to remember there were problems before it hit. Before COVID-19, 1 in 5 countries saw per capita incomes decline in 2020. Now the pandemic's caused even greater declines, and that's resulted in financial shocks ranging from disruption in industrial production to rising insecurity amongst workers. That's been catastrophic for the economic growth of developing and low-income countries, and it's had a hugely damaging effect in the developed world as well.
When you say that, Fee, you realise how important it is to get this goal right and the large system problems that we need to tackle. I have to say straight off the bat, I found this a difficult one to struggle, because the first thing that jumped out to me when looking at this goal is you don't have to have decent work to have positive economic growth. And I think the world has been on a pathway that has done exactly that. It's pushed for economic growth and hasn't really considered what decent work actually is. So I think we should start by saying, and I'd also like to highlight, I was a banker in London in a highly esteemed position with so many benefits. Some would say all of the benefits. And I wasn't happy. And I didn't feel like it was decent work. My wife was a medical student at the time, and she was in hospitals helping people. I would go home every day and just feel like I haven't done anything with my day apart from move millions of pounds around on a screen. And of course, that is a very subjective feeling. And of course, I'm very lucky that I even was in the position where I got to think about the importance of that. But even just from that small example, it's so hard to define what decent work is.
I think one of the things that's really important is understanding that decent work means different things in different places. But actually, it's not really a question of the developed versus the developing, or the global north versus the global south, because everywhere in the world, there are people being paid below a living wage. They're being exploited and they're hoping for the best. That's not necessarily a great way to live. If COVID's shown us anything, it's been the fine line that exists between earning enough to live and being in trouble. The worst affected have often been those in the lowest paid jobs, from delivery drivers to cleaners, who have a critical role to play in keeping society functioning during the pandemic. So what we need to do is identify what we actually mean in this conversation by decent work and economic growth. There is an important aspect, which is the subjectivity of decent work and economic growth, but we have to agree the terms of our discussion if we're going to be able to move it forward.
Yes, absolutely.
So what is decent work?
I think
is it ensuring that child labour isn't being used to make trainers? There's an issue there, but what if the family needs the children to work there in order for the family to survive? How's that going to work?
I think one way you could define decent work, Fee, is, do you love your job? That's one metric of decent work, whether you are sweeping the roads or whether you are a top flight corporate lawyer. That's one way of defining it, but that's hard to quantify. That's a quality question. On the quantity side, I suppose it comes down to how much does one earn? Because in society, the more you earn, the easier your life can be, because you can provide more goods and services to yourself and those around you. So when you find out that 2 billion people of the 8 billion in the world live on around $1 a day, that is a pretty screaming red flag to me that more decent work needs to be found, that they can earn more than $1 a day.
But I think there's a real issue. I'm not disagreeing. I think that's absolutely true. But we need to understand the relative nature of decent work. If we're talking about having enough to support you and your family, you have to think about also what it costs to do that. So actually, one of the things I think we need to talk about is, we know that globally poverty is a hugely challenging issue. We know that in the global south, there are people living on nothing. But, in the US, child poverty is the third worst in the OECD. In the gig economy, people don't have job security. How are you supposed to be able to function and live your life when you don't know if you're going to earn enough money this week to pay your bills and feed your kids? Did you know that 65% of all workers around the world in 2016 engaged in what we call the informal economy, meaning, without contracts, without safety nets, without, often not necessarily fully compliant with all of the regulations in any country, but that's well over half the world's population, working under informal conditions.
Yeah, that is mental. So to get on a more sustainable development pathway, therefore, perhaps that people have fair working pay for fair working contracts, how would you attack that fee? Do you think it's down to governments to put policies in place, or do you think it's down to people to lobby businesses to put these policies?
I think it's more complicated than that, because I think a huge amount of this comes back to political polarization. There's huge issues around what people think is a good idea. One of the things that has come up again and again is trying to build some kind of social safety net, this idea of a minimum wage or a living wage, because often the minimum wage is not the same thing as a living wage. The right to a living wage as a universal human right was actually put in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. That's the idea that everyone who works has the right to just and favourable remuneration for himself, his family, and his existence in a way that's worthy of human dignity, even though admittedly they only talk about men.
And I think it's a great idea, from a policymaker perspective. Well done. Put a social safety net of a living wage or a basic wage. However, and that is a really good idea. However, when you look at the negative gap that there is between the minimum wage or the living wage and where asset prices are, there's a massive gap between if I'm working and living on minimum wage, I can't afford to buy a house, quality food, do a lot of the nice things in life that you would expect in a developed country.
Well, I think the key issue here is this difference between the minimum and the living wage. So during the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt signed a living wage into law in the US because the idea was he was concerned that workers did not have enough bargaining power because the unions were under attack. He was concerned that consumers didn't have enough purchasing power to actually get the things that make life decent, the way you mentioned. What's really interesting is that actually in the US now, it has the lowest minimum wage of all G7 nations. So that's both in terms of purchasing power and in terms of the poverty rate. I think the figure in the US for minimum wage is that if you factor in inflation, it's actually down 30% since 1968. So the real value of that income has actually gone down over the last 50 years. And
you know what that's not? It's not sustainable. And really bad things will happen from it. So that has to be addressed if the US wants to be a fully functioning developed country. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with a two-tier America.
Now, there is an issue there that politically it's very difficult. There are a lot of people who are very opposed to the idea of a minimum wage, let alone a living wage. In the US, the Department of Health and Human Services actually suggested that a living wage was $12.60 an hour for a full-time worker. Now, I think currently it's $7.25, and that's for a full-time worker. If you're on some short-term contract with no guaranteed hours, you've got no idea what you're going to get paid. Now, in the UK, I think it's really interesting. We have both a minimum wage and a living wage, but apparently one turns into the other when you turn 23, because obviously the price of everything changes as you change your age.
So let's look at what we can do to fix this. And we've talked about it before, but we think it's such a good idea, we're going to talk about it again. And that is a universal basic income. We've seen a little shimmer of what this would look like through the furlough scheme, globally, actually. And yes, it has big tax implications, but it's kept a lot of businesses, people in their homes from bankruptcy, and it's been a massive social experiment, right? Fee,
Yeah,
are there any places around the world? We know we've touched on Finland, and we were talking before.
Well, before we get to the different examples, I really want to think about this tax issue and who pays for it, because one of the things under discussion, certainly in the UK, I think you have to earn 12,000 a year before you get taxed. But if you're going to have a universal basic income, why don't you start tax levels higher, but tax higher at the higher rates? And if you're concerned about, potentially losing the incentive to make a lot of money, start taxing people at 10 million, or not literally everybody, but the higher rates of tax at 10 million. You've got people like Jeff Bezos who are making 323 million a day just on their prices. What was that?
But they pay tax on that.
Most of them don't, because that's the whole point about having lawyers. It's tax avoidance, not evasion, because that's illegal.
Yeah, but that's not their problem. That's the system's problem. That's the system.
No, but that's what I'm saying. I'm just saying there are solutions to the challenge of where the money comes from. Because I personally believe that once you've got your first billion, why do you need more? You don't win if you have the most toys when you die.
I completely agree with you, Fee. You almost get to a point where you couldn't even spend it quick enough.
And believe me, I've thought about it. I've imagined what it's like to have loads of money. I would have some really nice places to live and the most amazing party you have ever seen. But that's not reality.
I'm with you.
And I think what's really interesting
we've all done that.
Talking about a billionaire and how money can be used in a positive way. Jack Dorsey, I know, has been involved in providing philanthropic funding for UBI experiments. So there are programs in Finland, there's programs in Brazil, but there's also pilot programs in the US. I think they started. Yeah, no, I know. Seriously, 2019, the first pilot program for a UBI project in the US started in Stockton.
Hang on. So you're telling me that under the Trump government, there was a UBI program?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not universal because it's a pilot and it's partial, but what you have is exactly what happened with Action on Climate Change. The federal government said, look out for yourselves because we're not bothered. And mayors, states, towns, cities went, we can't function like this. We can't live like this. We have to find a new way of doing things. We have to protect the weakest and most vulnerable. So these different projects are, around giving people cash and helping them live not in fear of lack of food and lack of healthcare. There's elements in the US, certainly, not just about lower income families, but also trying to address the systemic problems caused by racial injustice. So support for young Black mothers, for young Black fathers separated from their children. This whole idea is about bringing everyone to a better state of living, not just leaving people down, not leaving them behind, but bringing everyone forward to a fairer, more equitable and possibly cleaner way of living.
Yeah. So you just talked about why don't we just tax the richer because they have a lot more money? That's one way of looking at it for sure. And I think, is it a valid argument? Possibly. But we also then need to come back and look at the capitalist society and how it's been set up. And, you absolutely love Milton Friedman. Not.
Oh, don't even get me started.
But what he said, he's a smart guy, he's a well peer-reviewed economist. He said in a newspaper that companies' only responsibility is to their shareholders. Now, it's just
so ridiculous. It upended generations of economics, and it's taken decades to get past it.
Well, we're still not past it because that's still the current structure. However, there is now this shining beacon, which is more sustainable. So in investing, you've got the ESG movement, which is all about stakeholder capitalism, conscious capitalism, thinking about the environment, thinking about society, thinking about the governance structures you're working within, which will drive capital to places where it's needed, as in I'm talking about private and institutional capital, to places it's needed rather than just into the pocket of shareholders and F everyone else.
And I think that's a really important point, because when I talk about taxing billionaires, it might sound punitive. What I'm really talking about is a change in the system and a change in the way that we actually think about value. So I think it could be a really great idea if this is our point where we start to talk about what we mean by economic growth and whether or not the system we're living under is truly fit for purpose.
Yep. Okay, let's address this. So I think we've unpacked there what decent growth is in its different elements, or at least had a stab at it. Now let's look at economic growth. The UN says economic growth should be a positive force for the whole planet. Now I ask the question, is that the current state of affairs with economic growth?
The UN thinks economic growth is a positive force for the whole planet because financial progress creates decent and fulfilling jobs while not harming the environment. That clearly isn't the case today. What it means is we've got to protect labour rights. We need to put a stop to things like modern slavery and child labour. But if we promote job creation with expanded access to banking and financial services, we keep coming back to this question of, access to the things that make society function. But if we can do that, we can make sure that everybody gets the benefits of entrepreneurship and innovation. The challenge is, as you say, that definition is based on a historical understanding of what economic growth is actually all about. And how do we understand it? So traditionally, the obvious definition of economic growth is growth in GDP, so the income from goods and services. The problem with traditional economics is that it's always ignored externalities. That's the impact of resource extraction, the social impacts of insecurity, labour exploitation, the good of society as a whole. But what about, all the elements of being human that play out through community and security and friendship and family and green space and mental health? There was an old-fashioned idea exemplified by Milton Friedman, my favourite economist of all time, was that trickle-down economics would make everybody richer, that it would end up levelling up the poor. That hasn't happened. We need to integrate an understanding of where intangible value lies.
Yeah, I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. And for the economists, for the bankers, if there are any of you listening to this, what you do by accounting for societal benefits, environmental benefits, governance benefits, is you're essentially creating new asset classes there that you can price and turn into a monetary value that you can then trade. So it's really interesting for you to focus on sustainable development pathways and the allocation of resources to do good, not just to give a return. You can do good things and have a positive return. And this is such a cool part of finance that's only been created in the last few years, which is epic.
Yeah, and I think there is one issue that has to be mentioned, which is there is a lot of concern, and understandable concern, that the financialization of intangibles, this idea that you put a price on security and safety and the environment, etc., that this will lead to it being completely financialized and not valued in and of itself. But the reality is human beings value things in odd ways. And if there's a value to something, we can look to protect it in a way that we didn't before. You and I, Alex, have talked about Bitcoin quite a lot.
Yep. And
this idea that there is no value in Bitcoin except the value we as human beings give to it.
Of course, it's a nice
story.
It's
like it's the delusion of money. We only agree money is worth anything because we all agree it's worth something.
Absolutely. So therefore, why can't you put a price on human capital, on social capital, on relationship capital? And this, I've just touched on a few there, but there's a concept which is expanding on traditional economic thinking of capital, but is introducing not just financial capital, but manufacturing capital, human capital, social capital, relationship capital, intellectual capital, and natural capital. These are called the 6 capitals. There is an academic paper that does 8 capitals, and that's talking about even more intangible stuff like emotional capital. But let's just stay with the 6 capitals for now. Firstly, I think it's quite a tough pill for traditional economists to swallow, to get their head around this, that you can put a value on this stuff. But I think for those of us that are looking to the future and how we can work with nature, work with society, protect society, and bring it in line with capital, because essentially, some people don't like this, but stuff happens where the money is. And if there's no money in there, if there's no money pointed towards a cause, they often fall flat on their face.
And that's the thing. I think the thing that's really important here is to differentiate between money and capital, because capital is what underpins everything that we do. And what we're saying is it's worth looking beyond financial capital. It's worth understanding there's a value to all these other elements of what we do. One of the challenges is, how does a company account for that? How does a country account for that? When we've traditionally said, well, obviously we measure our performance by GDP. But GDP per capita is really interesting, because this speaks to the inequalities between those with the most and those with the least. There may be an average increase of GDP per capita, but what does that mean for the poorest?
Yeah, absolutely. And by bringing in these 5 new metrics to the 6 capitals, it gives an ability to allocate resources to the poor. You know, if you'd said 10 years ago, there would be a field of something called impact investing, where people want to invest their money for good. A banker would be like, what? But now there are billions of pounds and dollars and whatever currency under management in impact investing. People purely want their money to go to impactful causes, and it has a positive financial return.
Yeah, that's the thing.
It's amazing.
Positive financial return plus everything else. That's
exactly
what makes it.
The outcomes of that investment, of utilizing that capital, is a positive outcome, whether it be social, whether it be natural, whether it be, let's go back to ESG, whether it's a governance thing, whether it's making the system more robust. And the same can be said for climate finance. You know, you've got money needed to invest in mitigating climate change, and you've got money needed for adapting the world to make it more resilient. And they're two brand new, well, not brand new, but they're 2 new investment fields that didn't exist 20 years ago. And
40 years ago.
40 years ago, thanks, Fee. But investors can put their money to work, often with a positive return, to shore against climate change.
Yeah, and I think that there's a brilliant connection here to the concept of the zero growth model, because people hear zero growth and they freak out. They think stagnant societies, think nothing's growing. But actually what this is about is a way of dealing with the negative impacts of human activity. So the idea is not that it's no growth at all. A better way to think about it perhaps is steady state economics. What that means is an idea of keeping GDP and resource use stable. But you can only do that if you start to value the things that are not financial. It's about using resources efficiently, and it's about maximizing human well-being. So it's not about stagnation, which is, going to have unemployment, it's going to have economic pain. It's actually about perhaps a wider distribution of wealth and a wider definition of what that wealth actually means. And in this sense, what it boils down to is the broadest amount of economic security for the broadest amount of people.
And we were talking earlier about economic growth, how that happens. Do you tax the rich? Do you change tax structure? Well, how about this? Taking a look at these 6 capitals, the value of ecosystem services. Now that's pricing in air quality, what nature does for us, growing crops. We don't put a value on that so far. If you did, in 2014 was the most recent data I could find, ecosystem services were valued globally at $145 trillion that we do not currently account for what nature gives us in our economic system. If you did that.
Can I just interrupt and explain? Because I think some people may not understand ecosystem services. It
Sure.
literally is the value of the things that we live in. An economy doesn't exist in isolation. We live on land, we breathe air, we drink water. people survive on the food that they eat, that enables them to work in those companies that provide goods and services that we measure our GDP by. So it's about being realistic about the fact that nothing happens in isolation.
No, absolutely. And I don't want you as listeners to go, hang on, are you trying to commodify nature? This is literally accounting for the benefits that nature gives us. And if we work with nature, you can start unlocking this value. If you just want to follow the same development pathway we've been on by extracting, using and dumping in a very unsustainable manner, it's hard to account for these ecosystem services because you're just degrading the value of that nature portfolio every year. Whereas if you work with them, with regenerative business models, you can grow that portfolio of natural capital.
And there's a brilliant way of looking at this. And this is this idea that, the idea behind introducing these other capitals is that only once you can measure something can you manage it. So you're pricing damages, whether it's, the clean air or the impact of carbon dioxide. So one example that came out, I don't know if any of you guys have read the Dasgupta report, but it's all about natural assets in the UK. One of the things that is really exciting to me is this growth in understanding. So if you look at the UK, look at wood in the UK. So the value of timber sales in the UK is around 275 million. But if you factor in all the other things that trees do, so the sequestration of carbon, they're helping keeping soil solid and preventing floods, taking pollution out of the air, regulating temperature, the natural capital value is over 12 times their timber value. That means it's not a sensible idea to just cut down trees and sell them, because you're going to have to replace all of those services with something else.
Yeah, and coming back to my investment background, that is so interesting. From my sustainability background, that is epic because it means capital starts working with nature rather than against it. It's a no-brainer to me. It's obviously, for us, for myself and Fee, it's a no-brainer. But it's a complete and utter paradigm shift for most people to get their head around. And, that's why it's tough. But that's, one of the big reasons we want to talk to you and show you these ideas, show you these new ways of working, and show you how we can get on a more, I'm going to say it again, sustainable development pathway, because this is what this podcast is all about. There's another crazy idea about governments replacing GDP with gross ecosystem products. I'm not going to talk about it too much because it's so new and out there, but I am going to put a link in the show notes for anyone that wants to read that paper. One other thing I would say, what are you going to talk about, Fee?
I was just going to talk about the fact that I think there's just a really nice way of encapsulating this. What we're talking about is the need to reinvent economics to account for reality. So anyway, that brings us towards the end of our quick skip through some of the ideas underlying SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. Now, in some ways, it might look like a little bit of a battle between different approaches to how we should solve the world's problems. But actually, I think it's a combination of all of them. It's about using the tools and lessons of the last couple of 100 years, combining that with the physical and social sciences, which are helping us understand the world we live in, and using them all to create a fairer, more sustainable future for everyone.
Again, we're not experts on this podcast, but we're hoping our discussion has raised some interesting questions for you. And really, there are three main things to take away from this.
So the first one is that societies and economies need to pay every member of society enough to take an active part, whether that's in circulating money through the economy through spending, taking time caring for others, inventing and innovating new solutions to problem, or just making massive amounts of money to drive the economy forward.
Second one, globally, people are beginning to understand there is more to value and return than money alone. Companies need to understand that there are new ways of looking at value, and they are becoming very much mainstream. If you don't understand what they are and what they mean, then your future could be at risk if you're not prepared.
And thirdly, it's up to us. We need to decide what sort of world we want to live in. If we want to build a sustainable future, we're going to need new technologies and products. We're going to need new policies and financial models, and we're going to need unprecedented behavioural change. And these can all be built on an evolving understanding of our relationship with the world around us and the impact every single one of us can have as an individual, within a company or a community, or even within a nation.
Only by learning together can we create opportunities for people to discuss and collaboratively examine ways in which we can provide practical solutions to climate and sustainability challenges. And that's really what this pod is all about.
So, if you like us, rate us, subscribe, and please join us next week as we journey on to becoming sustainable AF.